Curious people. Welcome to Curious People Wanted, a program by the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport, Connecticut. My name is Adrienne Saint-Pierre, and I'm the curator here at the Barnum Museum. Our program series is designed to tell the interesting backstories of artifacts in our collection, and there are many, so let's get started on this group. This is a collection of newspapers, as you can see, that we have in the collection, and they are no ordinary newspapers. These newspapers were edited, published, printed by none other than P.T. Barnum himself. Now, these papers are extremely rare, so we're very lucky to have these. We have 13 complete ones and a couple of fragments. And each newspaper consists of 2 large sheets printed on both sides. So it's a 4-page weekly newspaper. The print is very tiny, so I can imagine it might take a week to get through reading one newspaper. So the baker's dozen that we have here, 13, really represents a fraction of the total output because P.T. Barnum published this newspaper every week for 3 solid years, from 1831 to 1834. Now, the story of how they came to be here at the Barnum Museum is really quite interesting, and I will get to that, but as with most things in our collection, there's sort of layers to the story. So first I want to start out by telling you a little bit about how Phineas Taylor Barnum came to be a newspaper man. He was 21 years old and married and living in Bethel, Connecticut. Now, as you can imagine, Barnum was an opinionated person, and he began writing letters to the editor of the Danbury newspaper, finding that because the editor's views differed from his, the editor was not printing them. And he was rather incensed about this. And, you know, being 21, he just decided, well, I guess I'm going to start my own newspaper. Now, that's quite an undertaking. It was really a kind of soup to nuts operation, and it's not as if Barnum, as a young boy, had apprenticed to a printer, so he really had to learn a lot in a hurry. He didn't have a long formal education, shall we say, either. So again, he was really making a bold move in deciding that he was going to start his own newspaper. Well, he called it the Herald of Freedom, and then later on it had a double title, Herald of Freedom and Gospel Witness. So Barnum had very strong opinions about politics and religion, and he himself had grown up attending the Congregational Church, which was the dominant church in Connecticut from colonial times on. He did not agree with the kind of Puritan view of humanity's innate wickedness and a punitive God. And he really, as a young man, decided he preferred the teachings of the Universalist Church. So those were his leanings. And partly why he was expressing his opinions to the editor at the Danbury paper. Now, backtrack a little to 1818. That's a significant date in Connecticut's history because it was the year that Connecticut held a constitutional convention. P.T. Barnum was only a kid at that time. He was 8 years old. But in that year, Connecticut decided to create a state constitution. Until that point, they'd really been operating under a charter that was created during colonial times. So, you know, it was about time they got around to creating a state constitution. One of the focuses of the convention was the disestablishment of the Congregational Church. So what that meant really was untangling the connections between church and state, because really, you know, Congregational Church and government were kind of entwined, had been for centuries. And Barnum felt that was wrong, and he had a very strong sense of what was right and wrong. So Connecticut is called the land of steady habits. So you can imagine in 1818, new constitution, but things don't change overnight. And attitudes and ways of doing things persisted for a long time. So a dozen years later, there's Barnum writing to the Danbury newspaper editor about these very issues. Barnum started his newspaper. He would print some stories from other newspapers. That was common at the time. He would go up to Hartford, Connecticut to get news from the capital. And you know, there were even a few ads in the paper. I kind of like these little ads because you get some pictures then. What I particularly love, though, is that in the top left column here, he tells us that the Herald of Freedom is printed every Wednesday morning a few rods south of the meeting house in Bethel, Connecticut. Phineas T. Barnum. A rod is about 16.5 feet. So with that little clue, it's just kind of exciting to think that we know just exactly where these newspapers were printed. So Barnum ended up going to jail as a result of his foray into the newspaper trade, and that's quite a fascinating story. In fact, he ended up in trouble with the law 3 times. He was sued for libel. So I consider it just an amazing piece of good luck that among these newspapers that we have, this small collection of 13, are newspapers that he actually published from jail. How cool is that? So this one I have out here, which is dated October 10th, 1832, has a column here titled "A Voice from the Prison," right? Apparently the prison was, or his cell, had wallpaper and carpet, so it wasn't too terrible, and he was allowed to continue to publish his paper. I'll just read you a couple lines from the beginning of this article. What? The editor of the Herald in prison? Yes, kind reader, it is not less strange than true. We were tried before the Superior Court in this town on Thursday last for an alleged libel against one Seth Seeley, a Presbyterian fanatic in Bethel, in which he was charged with inhumanely cheating a poor, utterly destitute orphan boy out of $17 by taking advantage of his necessity and buying from him a good note worth $42 for the sum of $25. So basically he was cheating this poor lad out of $17. And he shaved like the interest rate on the note. It was called usury. So that's what Barnum was sent to jail for, was that he called out this gentleman, Seth Seeley, and put it in the newspaper. And Seeley, needless to say, sued him for libel. Barnum's 60 days in jail were productive, shall we say, because he used the controversy to actually get more subscribers. So he came out of jail with a longer list of subscribers to his newspaper. And he had a good deal of support from neighbors and friends in his hometown of Bethel. So when he was to be released, they organized an incredible parade, right? You know, this is true Barnum style, even though he's only, 22 years old at the time. So they have musicians, they had speechifying, they had the whole works, and off he goes on this parade from Danbury back to Bethel. So it's a great story, and in his autobiography, there is an illustration, showing that little incident. He was very proud, of course, to kind of get his own back on Seth Seeley, who, I should add, in years to come, would be the father-in-law of one of P.T. Barnum's daughters. How ironic is that? In 1834, Barnum sold his newspaper business to a brother-in-law, the husband of one of his sisters, and it was continued for about another year, and then ended. So, they're 3 years, 4 years, but they're pretty rare documents to have. So let me tell you how the Barnum Museum came to have this collection, because I still am amazed about this story. Let's fast forward to the 1980s, when a gentleman out in Fresno, California, purchased an old second-hand desk. Now, this desk had been shipped from Boston, Massachusetts, across the country to California, and whoever had shipped it either didn't have the money to pay or decided they didn't want it. But anyway, this desk was sitting there, and so the storage company decided, well, we got to get rid of it. We'll put it up for sale. So this gentleman buys the old desk, and in the drawers he finds these newspapers. There are 13 Herald of Freedoms, and then there are 2 other newspapers which are competitors. One is called the Connecticut Repository, and the other one, the Bridgeport Messenger. So these were direct competitors to P.T. Barnum. He must have gotten out his magnifying glass and, looked these over carefully and then found Phineas Taylor Barnum's name on it. So he recognized that a lot of the writing in there was to do with the Universalist beliefs, and he contacted the Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno and offered them the collection of newspapers. He thought that was the place for these to be because of Barnum's beliefs and their connection to the newspapers. So they took them. They were delighted. They wrote about them in the church newsletter and gave them a little publicity. But then ultimately, the church decided that they should have a permanent home in a museum. So they came to the Barnum Museum, and we're thrilled to have them. As you can see, they are protected in Mylar, but we've also digitized these. So you can actually go online to the Connecticut Digital Archive and look in the Barnum Museum collection, and you can read these, and it's a lot easier because you can zoom in and just to see it much more clearly than you could just by looking at these as is. So we're excited to have these. When I think about the story of finding these newspapers in an old desk, I just kind of wonder, it almost seems spooky. And was this maybe the desk that he had while he was in jail, and these things just got left behind? Because, how did we get so lucky that we have these issues from the jail and the competitors' newspapers? So we'll probably never have an answer to that, but it's fun to think about, and it's a great story and wonderful to have this bit of P.T. Barnum's earliest career as a newspaper man, a profession that served him well in later years, I must say. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the Herald of Freedom newspapers, and I look forward to seeing you again on another episode of Curious People Wanted. Thank you.